Welcome to Mission Majjhima, Ajahn.
Ajahn.
Ajahn, tell us about Majjhima 98, the Vasettha Sutta.
So the Vasettha Sutta begins near Ichanangala, where there's a gathering of well-respected Brahmins. Some of them we will recognize from the previous chapter, including Chanki and others. And we then learn about two students, Bharadvaja and Vasettha, who are walking and debating whether or not one is a Brahmin by birth, which is Bharadvaja's position, or by action, by their deeds, which is Vasettha's position. Interestingly, Vasettha is a disciple of a famous Brahmin named Pokarasati, who we get to see the conversion of to Buddhism in Digha Nikaya 3. And actually his conversion marks a turning point in the conversion of many well-respected Brahmins to the Buddhist teaching, which is kind of a beautiful cascade to see. In fact, there's these beginnings of faith described in this discourse, but we actually later on, I believe in Digha Nikaya 27, encounter Bharadvaja and Vasettha, these two students waiting for ordination. So happy ending. Surprise. So they are talking, debating, not able to convince one another, and eventually say, I've heard that the Buddha is staying nearby, and go and ask him whether one is a Brahmin by birth or by action. So something very interesting happens there. First, much of this discourse is in verse, in poetry. And we've encountered other discourses like that as well. This discourse, like those, is also found in the Sutta Nipata, one of the earliest compilations of texts found in the shorter length discourses, the Khuddaka Nikaya. And one quality of these early texts is this poetic form. It's a good indicator, and it's fascinating to read. And you can tell when they ask their questions of the Buddha in poetry, in verse, it may also be an indication of them kind of trying to display their aristocratic merit or their kind of intellectual acuity. It's kind of a battle of, not a battle, but it's a way of speaking with one another, which was considered very refined. So they ask this question, and the Buddha is quite skillful in how he answers. Instead of immediately siding with Vasettha that one is a Brahmin by action rather than birth, which is much closer to the Buddhist position, he begins by taking them through just some things they can all agree on, kind of a colorful romp through talking about, are trees reckoned by, are trees of different, trees are of different nature, and birds, and all the realms of animals are reckoned by their birth, by their characteristics, their jati. But then he gets to the humans, and he says, these beings are not distinct by birth, actually. It's just a way of speaking in the world. And then he goes through the different occupations that each person might take, and says they're defined by that action rather than the birth. So if one robs, then one is a robber, or reckoned a robber by the world. And then interestingly, he waits for his thrust of saying one who performs these purohitya duties, these kind of Brahminical duties, is reckoned a sacrificer, a yajiko, not a Brahmin. So he's taking, that's kind of his thrust at Bharadvaja's argument, and by kind of redefining the word Brahmin. He then goes, but he leads people up to this point before kind of contradicting, which is very skillful. And then he goes on to praise what a Brahmin is in the Buddhist conception, or redefining this term as an arahant. And it's a beautiful set of verses. I'll read one or two. Who endures without a trace of hate, abuse, violence, and bondage too, with strength of patience well arrayed. He is the one I call a Brahmin, who like the rain on lotus leaves or mustard seed on the point of an awl, clings not at all to sensual pleasures. He is the one I call a Brahmin. So it's kind of just a beautiful set of verses praising the enlightened being. And finally, he finishes really by affirming Vasettha's view of being a pure being by action, after he's redefined what a pure being, what a Brahmin means, a divine being. For those who do not know this fact, wrong views have long underlain in their hearts. Not knowing, they declare to us, one is a Brahmin by birth. One is not a Brahmin by birth, nor by birth a non-Brahmin. By action is one a Brahmin. By action is one a non-Brahmin. And then he speaks even further. He takes them further and talks about supreme Brahmanhood, Brahmana Muttamang. And in this case, he talks about the Arahant being completely beyond even action. And he talks their emotions to dependent origination and the cycle of karmic effect and result, and says that a true Brahman, the ultimate conception of a Brahman, steps beyond all that. So just a kind of beautiful discourse where the Buddha uses the terms that he's given to redefine skillfully. He brings people along and then redefines what a divine being is to people who might gain faith, and they do. Ajahn, what would you draw out of this discourse?
A few things to draw out. One is the location. So Icca Nangala, we find a number of suttas that occur here as well. It is, as you noted, the place where a lot of these Brahmins live. This is where Chunky, who we encountered in Majjhima 95, where he lives. This was his stomping ground. Todeya, Janusoni, who we'll encounter in the next sutta, at the end of the next sutta, and several others who these two pupils, Vasettha and Bharadvaja, are students of. So it's a thorough Brahmin stronghold. One other thing that happens in this locality, Icca Nangala, is the Buddha actually goes on retreat. So this is rather fascinating that at least in two occurrences, the Buddha was said to go on retreat for 2 weeks, and then in another occurrence was to go on retreat for actually 3 months, in which he instructed, let no one approach me other than the monk who's going to bring me my meal. So which is fascinating just to contemplate that even the Buddha saw benefit in he himself stepping back from the world. And so that occurred at Icca Nangala as well. There's a rather wonderful, amazing sutta called the Nagita Sutta, which occurs here, which I would suggest everybody check out as well in the Anguttara 8s. But here we find Vasettha and Bharadvaja speaking, and Vasettha, of course, already has faith. And I think what I'd like to do is just draw out some of the verses in particular, because they're so packed with meaning. I mean, the vast majority of this sutta is, unlike most suttas of the Majjhima Nikaya, it is very verse heavy. So this is one way that the Buddha would teach, is both with narrative and with verse. And because he's talking to these Brahmins who are skilled in verse, in the Vedas, which are in verse, he himself takes that up and then goes more deeply and then reinterprets a lot of the words which they're used to amongst themselves. And specifically, there are 28 verses which occur at the end of this sutta, with the Buddha speaking, where he redefines what it is to be a Brahmin. And he says, Tamaham Brahmi Brahmanang. Such a one is one who I call a Brahmin, or a holy person. So you read a couple, and I'll just read a few more. So reading some of the Pali as well, so you get a sense of how these, the meter of them work with one another. Akodanang vatavantang silavantang anusadang dantang antimasarirang tamaham brahmi brahmanang. One who does not flare up with anger, dutiful, virtuous, and humble, subdued, bearing their final body. Such a one is one I call a Brahmin. So, sila vantang, one who does the sila, one who has good habits. Vata vantang, which is translated here as, that's dutiful. And this is actually what Vasettha and whereas Bharadvaja defined a Brahmin as by caste, Vasettha says that actually it's one who has sila and one who is vata sampada, or is accomplished in vata, or the duties. Whereas here, the Buddha takes those two words, sila and vata, and points to actually the duties of a Buddhist practitioner, someone who's following the duties of the Four Noble Truths, understanding dukkha, abandoning its cause, realizing cessation, and developing the path. Yo dukkha sapajanati ideva kayamatano pannabarang visangyutang tamahang brahmi brahmanang. One who knows right here within themselves the destruction of all suffering, with burden lowered and detached, Such a one do I call a Brahmin. So here again, pointing very specifically to the Four Noble Truths. And the final one that I'll read is Gambira Panyang Medaving Maga Maga Sakovidang Uttamatam Anupatang Tamaham Brumi Brahmanam. Who with deep understanding, wise, can tell the path from the not path, who has attained the goal supreme, such a one I call a Brahmin. So again, defining the Brahmin not by any kind of religious observance or external show, but actually their internal Gambira Panya, the deep wisdom that they have within themselves. And Magga Magga Sakovidang, one who's skilled in what is the Magga, the path, the fourth noble truth, and what is not the path. On Sutta Central, this is one option that you have, is to have the Pali either right next to or just right after each line, English Pali, and you get a sense, especially with verse, with poetry, to see what the original looked like. And even if you learn how to pronounce Pali correctly, then what it sounds like as well. And it is more beautiful. There is a ring and a meter to it, which just can't come across fully in English. So Ajahn, what is the word of the week?
The word of the week is jati, which means birth, to be born, but it also means one's birth in terms of kind of caste used in the sutta that way. And it comes from the root jan, which means to be born or to come forth.
Okay. Well, we'll see you over on Zoom. And if not then we'll see you next week for Majjhima number 99.
Ajahn.